I'm delighted to be with you here today. I'm Jennifer Buckley from SWEEF Capital. I wanted to thank the Responsible Asset Owners team for giving us the opportunity to speak with these amazing leaders from around the region on the topic of diversity and inclusion. We have with us here today Deanne Stewart, who's the CEO of Aware Super, Fabienne Michaux, who's the Director of UNDP SDG Impact, Junice Yeo from the Executive Director for Eco Business, and Takuro Kimura from Women of the World Endowment, who is one of the founding board directors here. We have a short space of time, and I'd like to really focus on allowing you to have the opportunity to hear what our speakers have today. So to kick off, I was going to ask each of our panelists to talk about their perspectives on personally why diversity and inclusion matters to them and their organization. Perhaps starting with Deanne from Aware Super.
Wonderful. Well, thanks, Jen. And it's wonderful to join everyone today. If I just start, I guess, why you've said, why is diversity and inclusion important, both personally and from an organisational perspective? Well, starting with the personal first, and probably just starting with a little bit of a personal story. And I'd like you to all consider this scenario that you've got a senior head of role that you're about to hire. You've got a couple of really good candidates, possibly one candidate that's slightly stronger than the other, but that candidate has just arrived back into your country, is 5 months pregnant, likely about to go on an extended paternity leave. And then you've got another candidate that is a male and is not about to go on to paternity leave. What do you do? And this is something that I faced myself. When I came back to Australia, having lived overseas for 11 years, I was 5 months pregnant and was actually offered a role where they had several really strong candidates, regardless of the fact that I was about to go on to paternity leave. And the reason I bring that up is that it is in each of these micro moments that we set the tone as leaders of our organisation, and that gender equality really matters to each of us. So for me personally, it matters because I've certainly faced into many of those matters, but also when I think about my own children, both having a daughter and a son, I want to know that they have equal opportunity to shine, to reach their potential, and to have an amazing impact on this planet. So that's a very personal note. But from an organisational perspective, when we think of diversity and inclusion, there's several things, both from an organisational perspective. Ultimately, there is a war for talent, and talent matters. Having the very best talent in your organisation makes such a difference. And so why would you naturally limit it to 50% of the population? Certainly here in Australia, not only do women represent 50% of the population, but actually about 60% of those that graduate from university. And so actually being able to tap in and have really good balance across your organisation from a talent perspective matters. But secondly, just that diversity of ideas and thoughts and lived experiences. The reality is each and every one of us come from our own lived experience and our own perceptions. And there often is differences in lived experience between males and females and different perspectives that are brought to the table. And so being able to actually harness that and bring the very best, have really good challenge, robust debate, makes your organisation far greater. And then the other aspect I'd say from an organisational perspective is the cultural elements of having really strong balance between that masculine end and the feminine side. And what I mean by that is really making sure you've got that drive and ambition and high performance, but also that compassion and care and collaboration and understanding. That makes a very rich culture when you're able to get both of those in balance. And having a greater diversity across your organisation enables that. And the final point I'd make from an organisational perspective that I've seen live in action at our own organisation is the importance of psychological safety in really enabling your team to perform at their best. So if I think about psychological safety, being able to bring your best self to work, being able to bring your ideas and put that forward versus fear or shame or disrespect that's often seen in organizations that don't have that inclusive environment, that enables so much more talent and so much more potential in the organization. And just to give you our own stat at Aware Super, where we do tend to have both equal gender, both at a board level and at an executive level, then when we actually survey our staff and ask 2 questions, how inclusive do you find this environment? We actually have more than 95% of our staff give us 5 out of 5 on that. And then we ask the comment, do you feel that you are able to speak up in this organisation? More than 93% say that they can speak up. Now that for me is the real balance and the type of culture that you want to create, and that I think a real diverse and inclusive focus enables you to unlock in your organisation.
Thank you, Deanne. That's an incredible story from the Aware Super perspective and those statistics. From Fabienne and Junice, from your perspective, looking at more the broader market and regional trends within the market, from both personally and for your organizations, why do you see the topic of diversity and inclusion mattering?
Yeah, well, I guess from a personal perspective, I have had times in my life, particularly earlier in my life, where I've joked that I belong to, the largest minority group on the planet, composing 51% of the population, because oftentimes, even though we may be a majority, certainly, I had many lived experiences of being the only female in the room and having that sensation that perhaps I was talking another language, not necessarily breaking through in terms of being heard, or having that opportunity to really feel that your perspectives are valued. And I have seen a lot of change, and actually I have similar stories to Deanne, where 2 of the most significant shifts in my career and promotions came when I was heavily pregnant. So kudos to the organisation I was working for at that time, S&P, a global organisation that did create an environment where it was where there was a high degree of focus on diversity and equity in that sort of decision making. From a UNDP perspective, UNDP is a steward and also the appointed integrator of the Sustainable Development Goals within the UN family, by virtue of the fact that it has a footprint in 170 countries and deep relationships on the ground. And really at the heart of the SDGs is the overarching goal of leaving no one behind. So diversity, inclusion and equity are really core to delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals. As most of you would know, gender equality is one of the 17 goals itself, but importantly, gender and diversity and equity are cross-cutting goals through all of the Sustainable Development Goals, and we really need to be aware of the impacts in those areas on our ability to actually deliver on climate goals and other goals across the SDGs. With the work that I'm currently doing with UNDP, I'm leading an initiative called SDG Impact, which is really trying to accelerate the use of private capital to support delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals. And we're doing that through 2 main lines. We have the SDG Impact Standards, which are management standards for really putting sustainability in the SDGs at the core of decision making. And as part of that, the standards really focus on how to integrate managing for impact into organisational decision making, and a large focus is on stakeholder voice and making sure that we include stakeholder voice from underrepresented and excluded stakeholders, and from gender equity perspective, making sure that, and broader diversity perspective, making sure that we're actually reflecting diversity in terms of teams and throughout organisations at a leadership and board perspective, those stakeholder voices, including from a materiality perspective, considering that gender is actually a material impact that needs to be considered irrespective of whether organisations would consider it in the top impacts that they're having or not. Just recognising that at a system level, it's something that we really need to achieve. So we also have investor maps to highlight investment opportunity areas in developing markets. And last year we actually enhanced our methodology for those maps to explicitly include a gender lens as well. So on several fronts, it's pretty core.
Yeah, I thought I'd jump in as well, since the questions pertains to my line of work as well. So at EcoBusiness, we are a media, and we exist really to cover ongoing issues around sustainable development and responsible business. And as you can imagine, in this cross section, there are mounting issues in which diversity and inclusion plays a key role. And I think for us at EcoBusiness, one of the things we realize is that diversity exists at the heart of so many social issues today. But I think D&I issues also exist because they can never really be fully understood unless you are sitting in a position of the weaker one, whose voice is often overpowered by policies that favor the majority. And I think for this very reason, more needs to be done to give more opportunities for the weaker, smaller voices to be equally heard. Gender is a big one, of course, and women are disproportionately affected by COVID-19, but also even larger is the effects of climate change. In the last 2 years or 3 years or so, healthcare workers, caregivers, innovators, community organizers, so many of them are women. And so many of them are behind the fight against climate change. But the women, these are the very people who are also organizing. They're empowering each other to stand together. And so, at EcoBusiness, I think it's very important that we frame these great examples in a sense that we tell the narratives as they should be told, but we give more chances for those who don't necessarily have a voice to be heard. One example of this is, of course, in Asia or in ASEAN, especially the developing countries, is that women, they don't necessarily get legal rights to their land, which obviously often limits their decision-making power. And yet they are responsible for bringing in 60 to 80% of the food as domestic producers or assistants on the farm. So these are, great examples of how women are always contributing, even though they are of a lesser, standing in society in a sense. I live in Beijing. I live in China. This is a country whose race is largely homogeneous, but I think it was 50 years ago when Mao Zedong even said that women hold up half the sky. So I think these issues, even though they are prevalent even in China and in many parts of Asia, I think the truth is the awareness is there, the opportunity to seize the moment and give women the chances to succeed are there. But unfortunately, I think the awareness, of such unconscious bias is missing. And therefore, I think the role exists for the media to really tell the story in the best way possible.
And Tak-san, as sitting in Japan, for you personally, why is this topic something that matters to you and to your organization and endowment that is focused on women?
Yep. Well, thank you for having me first. I'm from Japan, but fortunately, I spent most of my professional life in international organizations. So it's not easy for me to describe how you and I would feel if I continue to work for companies in Japan or Japanese corporates in that culture. But I will mention this later. But Japan has a long way to go to catch up with other countries, developed or developing countries, both. So we have the many things to do. But for the organization that I'm part of, which is the Women of the World Endowment, the diversity and inclusion are the central part. And WoWE is a permanent capital, focused on the role of women as change makers to solve the world's key challenges. So we see women as actors and solution drivers. And so, we start with financial capital. We invest it in all asset classes to generate profits, and based on gender intersectional investment strategy. We then take the income, from our investments and reinvest in building intellectual capital with academic and research institutions, for example, that strengthen the field of gender intersectional investing and find practical solutions. So that is a sort of, the practice that we are doing now. And we also invest income as grants into organizations supporting women change makers, driving this systemic change. So we then use this strengthened gender intersectional strategy for our investments. In this way, we create a sort of virtuous cycle of financial and intellectual capital. And probably, Darren, it's if you can put it on the slide. Recently, my colleague, the CEO of WoWE, and another board member, Ruth Shaver, co-authored a book called The XX Edge: Unlocking Higher Returns and Lower Risk. So this book manifests WoWE's thesis, inclusion of more women as decision makers in your organizations result in a powerful and measurable financial advantage. And then this book is supported by extensive data, facts, and cases, and demonstrates that gender inclusive teams outperform most metrics. And what is also important to note is that this is not about zero-sum game, but a paradigm shift, which is very needed. Like Junice described, during the pandemic, we saw so many women negatively affected, but instead of taking it as a sort of cause for the zero-sum game, we would take it as a paradigm shift. And it's not having women pull up seat at the decision-making table, but expanding that table so more women can join as decision makers around that investment table. That is the sort of our thesis, and we are trying to, achieve that objective.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you. I mean, I think listening to each of you, the opportunities that exist when we're focusing in on gender, on diversity and inclusion, come through so strongly. What I'd like to move into, maybe starting with Fabienne and Junice, is from the opportunities seem clear. What do you see at the global and regional level as being some of the very key challenges?
Sure. Well, I think I think when we talk about gender, one of the statistics that we use quite often is that, achieving gender equity alone could increase the size of the global economy by 26%. So, that's fairly compelling just in and of itself, that there's a lot being left on the table by not dealing with gender equality. And I think, to Taksan's point, the issue around, diversity of thought and effective challenge in decision making to reduce risks, but actually to identify and optimize opportunities is really key. And I think that to me, one of the challenges is that oftentimes, even where there are programs around D&I, it's almost a compliance approach and a tolerance of diversity, rather than actually really looking to seek it out and celebrate it and be excited by the opportunity to actually bring those different perspectives together to drive to decision making that and outcomes that individually we couldn't get at. And I think that's the real opportunity, is to really celebrate and seek it out and look to leverage it as much as possible. I think from a challenge perspective, we see a lot of challenges in this space. Firstly, form over substance approaches, and measuring the wrong things. Oftentimes where, if you look at, often, seats on a board might be one of the key metrics, but, that's not necessarily going to drive systematic change on its own through an organisation. And we need to look at other elements that help to address some of the shortcomings. Data disaggregation is a really big issue. Oftentimes, different stakeholder perspectives are lost in averages, and we need to do a better job of identifying where we're using data sets that actually don't flush out those differences. And that's an area of key focus in the standards, but it's also an area of key focus across the UN in terms of the Office of Statistics and other places, to start really trying to draw out not only gender, but differences in terms of age and race, so that decision making can be improved. Outcomes continue to be really assessed in silos rather than holistically, and I think this talks to a question that came up in the chat before. Can we actually solve for the climate crisis without solving for social issues? And I think the answer to that is no, we can't. And inequality and social issues will be a constraint on our ability to drive climate action to the level that we need to. I think the last point, which I think we've already touched on, is really just that representation point. If we don't actually have representation in decision making and ensure that key roles are actually at the right tables and able to influence decision making, then that's going to be a constraint on those voices being heard. And I think, again, just reinforcing the point I made earlier, really important that extends outside the organisation to external stakeholders, and ensuring that we're actually including stakeholder voices, including underrepresented and excluded voices in decision making, and giving people some agency in decisions that impact them.
Yeah, and maybe just to add, I absolutely agree with Fabienne, especially at the point that climate change is so much linked to the issues around inequality and diversity, or the lack of. One of the things I think that was in my head as well is the fact that we can turn it around and say these are also opportunities to improve. But the truth is the gender disparity gap at the moment has been lengthened, I think, by 36 years, just because of, the pandemic and all the disparities that have not been able to be resolved. And so I think we are far behind what we should be in, and that's definitely a challenge. One of the things as well that's, I would say, is hindering progress is the fact that softer issues like gender, a bit like social issues in general, even human rights, modern slavery, they're difficult to report against, but also measuring progress is not as straightforward as, say, measuring emissions, for example, where you can put an audit to it, and then, it's very clear whether or not we've reduced our emissions or haven't. Well, gender is so light and so invisible sometimes, especially the discrimination of it. That's why domestic violence still exists today, and it falls behind the cracks, and nobody can really see it. And I think for sustainability and managing of gender issues in general, a well-oiled company that does this well cultivates diversity of thought, and in doing so, gender falls very nicely into these things. There's a appreciation for underrepresented voices. There are proper safeguards, especially on the psychological front. So these things are definitely opportunities, but when you don't see how you can progress, it's very difficult for any company to put in mechanisms unless they were forward thinking themselves. So sometimes it's really, the question about board representation, for example, is such a tricky one. A lot of people now are challenging board representation, challenging tenures on boards, just so that we can have a fresh mindset into how we can make boards more innovative, instead of the old, they say the white male type of, stereotype. So having, Asian representation, having having different types of representation, including gender, would certainly help boards to see a longer term perspective around business building. But unfortunately, again, it's easier said than done, I think, because it's harder to measure, I would say. So that's a big challenge there.
Thank you. And Deanne, I mean, from your perspective, I think it was very clear from your introduction, Aware Super has really integrated diversity and inclusion thinking into all aspects of your organization. I think I would be really keen to hear how, from the investment perspective, you're integrating this thinking into your investment frameworks and investment selection decisions.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. And it was important to start from an organisational perspective, because I think it's important that you walk the talk. Certainly, as one of the large super funds or pension funds here in Australia, it's important that we have our own shop in order as we hold companies to account. So if I think about then how we deploy that from an investment framework, well, first of all, it absolutely starts not just from a thesis, but from lots of research and knowledge that getting diversity right and being able to use that as part of the way you actually assess and engage with companies is value creating. So companies that have more diverse leadership, more diversity in their organization tend to outperform. And there's all sorts of research on this, and we've just heard a little bit from the book as well, and the research that was just talked about. But what I would also say is, if you look at some of the global research, say you take a gender lens, you actually say, well, if you look at the companies that have gender diversity or much more balance at the most senior levels, they tend to outperform their counterparts on their stock exchange by anywhere between 5 and 10%. So it's value creating. So then what we then do from an investment perspective is actually really look at how we incorporate that and integrate that, not just in our ESG, but in the way that we actually engage with our organizations and the types of conversations that we have and the disclosures that we'd like to see, because then we can actually see the progress over time. So we look at things, so for example, leadership. So certainly a number of the pension funds here in Australia had expectations of organizations that they should have at least 30% of their board being female. And so if you go back to 2015, that was at about 18%, but now it's actually progressed to 34%. So now what we're doing is a number of funds and global investors are saying, well, let's now start to see that more in a group executive perspective and see that disclosed. So what percentage of group executive are women versus male? And how do you actually show the progress over a period of time, knowing that it adds value to an organization? So it starts with the leadership. The next thing we then assess really is around culture and conduct. So when we engage with companies, we like to get under the bonnet in terms of what's really going on from a culture and a conduct perspective. And you actually talk through things like, what are the amount of sexual harassment claims that you see go through this organization? How do you make them more transparent? What's going on underneath the bonnet with some of the employment engagement, not just your overall score, but what are people saying around psychological safety, how inclusive this environment is, and actually really understand that. And then a great point that Fabienne was bringing up, the next thing we'd look at is then how do they interact with the community and key stakeholders. And we've certainly had a couple of spectacular fails here in Australia with organisations like Rio Tinto that got that horribly wrong in the way that they actually engage stakeholders and how value destructive that becomes. So these are the key things that we look at to really get underneath the bonnet in really looking at it from an investment lens. And why at the end of the day? Because ultimately it is either value creative or value destructive over the long term for organisations that really get it right or really get it wrong.
Thank you, Deanna. Deanne, we've got a question or a comment from Diana Reeves that it's great to have up on the screen with us. She has a question around something that is so clear, to have your own shop in order. How many organizations are missing this? How many organizations miss this from a fundamental concept perspective? I think this might be a good segue into for each of you to give examples of organizations that are really getting this right, or either as exemplars, and I think we can hear both Women of the World Endowment and We're Super would very much be in that category, but also those organizations that are making meaningful change in this area. They might not be perfect, but they're recognizing it and making significant change. Fabienne, Junice, do you have examples that you want to share there?
Well, I'll talk more at a system change level, I guess. I think that there are, there's in the sustainability space generally, but more specifically with gender, there's some amazing resources and platforms and things that people can use and that are already available, that I think that there's just a low level of awareness that they exist. So, things like the UN Women's Empowerment Principles, I think are a great place for organisations to start and go, well, how would I bring this to life in my organisation? UN Women on the capital front, partnered with IFC and ICMA to develop a practitioner's guide for using sustainable debt for gender equality. Jennifer, the SWEEF work on the gender lens framework is fantastic. These are things that are freely available and that organisations can look to help inform their own approaches. So I think the other thing I would say, and I think this is also a key part of the change we need to help support, is we're not on track to achieve the SDGs, where it's been very disappointing just how quickly gender equality tracked backwards as a result of the pandemic. We need to recognise that we've all got a long way to go. There's an enormous room for improvement across the board, and I think we need to work towards making it safer for people to say we're not there yet, and focus more on where we're starting and where we want to get to and the rate of change, rather than beating organisations up when they don't do well, or when they don't, or when they're brave enough to actually say, our performance isn't where it needs to be. And I think that the example of Rio Tinto, while very disappointing, at the same time, there's some light in that story, in that they were prepared to be very transparent in terms of that process and what their findings were. And I think we need more of that, because it will help to drive accountability and help actually provide an enabling environment to drive change.
Sorry, I was muted. No, I think just to chime in here, actually, I found the question the most difficult one, meaning to say there aren't really prominent examples of gender being managed well in organizations, especially big ones. And I think the reason is because it is a complex issue, but also it can happen in so many instances across an organization, so many departments. You can't necessarily say that all the processes are well managed in a way. So I kind of struggled there. And I think the best examples I could think of were the smallest startups that really tries to champion, women, especially with regards to helping very fundamental issues. One somebody I did interview was from Agria in the Philippines. Her name is Cherry Artilano, and she really helps focusing on uplifting farmers well, including women and youth, in core projects within agriculture. That's one. And another one was called Empower. Empower projects actually by the UNDP and UN Women, and really tackles intersections of gender and climate change. And these projects are mostly found in developing countries like Bangladesh, Cambodia, and Vietnam. I think in the rural areas, improving women's rights to finance, through innovative solutions like digital banking, microfinancing is really sort of breaking boundaries today and really making a significant difference. And we are, as a media at least, we are covering some of these stories to ensure that they get told and they inspire further action as well, especially with impact investing and funding. That usually helps as well. So hope that gives the 2 cents worth.
Thank you. And we're into our final minute. So I'd love to pass to Deanne and Taksan to have some final words from you on organizations that stand out. But also, Taksan, with WoWE, I know this is an area that's very much something you think about a lot around, is it even possible to have environmental sustainability without social sustainability? So perhaps if we start with Deanne, just an organization that stands out to you from a diversity and inclusion perspective, and then we'll finish with Taksan.
Yeah, so one organisation I came straight to mind that I would speak of, and then I'll just build on Fabienne's point really briefly around Rio. So one organisation that comes to mind, for example, certainly here in Australia, is Mirvac. Now it's in the property and construction industry, which you typically wouldn't think was great from an overall diversity perspective, but it's literally just been ranked number one in Equileap's gender equality report that was published last week. It has incredibly inclusive practices, very strong from a gender perspective, both policy and real action. But also importantly, you can see that translate into it being voted as one of the greatest places to work, and its performance is very strong. So you can absolutely see the impact that it has from a value creation as well as getting it right. And the final point that I'd raise, that building off what Fabienne said, when I talked earlier about Rio, I was actually more referring to the actions around blowing up the 46,000-year-old Dukan cave, and their lack of engagement in the community. But where I think they are getting it right is actually how transparent they've been on a recent report broadly into mining industry that actually does talk about the degree of bullying and sexual harassment, etc. They actually commissioned a report by one of the most senior women here in Australia that is an expert in the area, and then we're transparent with the results. The results were pretty ugly. It was 50% saying that they were bullied or sexually harassed, and actually 30% of women versus 7% of men saying they were actually sexually harassed at work. Now, that is not great, but at least the organisation has actually commissioned it, been really transparent, released it to the market, and then has clear actions in place. So when I was interviewed by journalists about what would we do, would we pull out of Rio, how do we actually chastise them? I would say you actually need to do the opposite. You need to say transparency is good. Now we need to see clear action and how we engage with them to make sure that that action is taken place. So that's some closing thoughts for you.
Thank you. And Taksan, environmental and social sustainability, do they go hand in hand?
Yeah, so that is the reason that we always focus on the gender intersectional strategy. That is not only about gender lens, but also about climate, care economy, circulate, and other type of focus. Not a simple ESG, but at the same time, I still think that the role to be played by financial institutions or investors is very significant, and for that purpose, the WoWE continues to develop and provide tools for asset managers and owners to come up with a portfolio to focus on those companies which have already a good, the habit, but particularly those who need to be lifted. And then that is where that investors' pressure need to be continue to be made. And then from that point of view, I think that all these the panelists here have big roles, each of us to play in the coming years. It's a sort of long-term battle, if you like.
Thank you. Well, thank all of you for your time today. I think we're at 12:16, so we need to finish up. But it was amazing to hear from each of you from a global perspective, regional perspective, local perspective on the theme around diversity and inclusion, why it matters, what the opportunities are, what some of the challenges are. It's clear from the challenges perspective, there's a lot of work being done, frameworks, tools that are out there. So please, everyone that's listening, if please direct yourself to those if this is an area where you're trying to integrate these concepts into your own organizations or investment thinking. So thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Bye.